Imagine it's 1869 and America is hiding a dark secret, one that's made the nation filthy rich, $3 billion. That's how much this secret property is worth. Not the factories, not the railroads, not the fancy mansions in Manhattan. No. We're talking about human beings, nearly 4 million enslaved bodies that plantation owners had put a price tag on, valued at an average of $800 per person in the slave markets. Let that sink in. The total value of enslaved people in America, calculated from actual sale records and insurance documents, was worth more than all American manufacturing, all the railroads, all the productive capacity of the nation combined. And that's not even counting the real moneymaker, cotton. In 1861 alone, American cotton exports were pulling in $250 million. That's over $9 billion in today's money, all of it built on backs that weren't getting paid a single cent. But here's where things get interesting. Because on a cold winter night in Savannah, Georgia, something unprecedented was about to happen. Something that would give birth to one of the greatest economic promises and betrayals in American history. It was January 12th, 1865. 20 black ministers, all of them former slaves except for one, are summoned to meet with one of the most powerful men in the Union Army, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. The Civil War is coming to an end. Sherman has just completed his infamous March to the Sea, where he led 60,000 Union soldiers through Georgia, destroying everything in their path from Atlanta to Savannah to cripple the South's ability to fight. But now he faces a different kind of challenge. Thousands of newly freed slaves are following his army, seeking protection and a chance at a new life. And for the first time in American history, someone in power is about to ask them a revolutionary question. What do you want for your own people? Their chosen spokesman, Reverend Garrison Frazier, didn't hesitate. At 67 years old, having purchased his own freedom for $1,000 in gold and silver, he knew exactly what his people needed. The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. What happened next would spark hope in millions and lead to one of the most devastating broken promises in American history. But before we continue, if you've enjoyed the video so far, leave a like and comment down below what you want us to cover next. 4 days after that historic meeting, Sherman put pen to paper. As a commanding general, he had the power to issue military orders that carried the full weight of federal law. What he wrote would become known as Special Field Order Number 15, and it was about to attempt something unprecedented in American history, giving millions of newly freed slaves a real shot at economic freedom. Think about it. 4 million people had just been freed from slavery, but freedom without economic power is just another form of slavery. These people had nothing, no land, no money, no resources, just their freedom papers and the clothes on their backs. Meanwhile, their former enslavers still owned all the land, all the wealth, all the power. This order was about to change all that, and it was America's first and only real attempt to provide reparations to the people who had built this nation's wealth with their unpaid labor. The deal was massive, 400,000 acres of prime Confederate land. That's about half the size of Rhode Island, or 3 times the size of New York City, stretching along the Atlantic coast from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way down to Florida's St. Johns River. That's roughly 200 miles of coastline. And this wasn't just any random patch of dirt. This was some of the richest land in the South. We're talking about abandoned rice fields, fertile islands, and prosperous plantations, all confiscated from Confederate owners who had fled when Union forces arrived. But what made this deal truly revolutionary was the fine print. First, this land was exclusively for black settlers. No white person except military officers could even live there. Second, these new black communities would govern themselves. Third, the military would protect these settlements until the freed people could protect themselves. And finally, each family would receive up to 40 acres of tillable ground. Later, Sherman would even throw in some surplus army mules to help work the land. For the first time, formerly enslaved people would have control over their own labor, their own land, and their own futures. And for a brief moment, it worked. It actually worked. By June 1865, Just 5 months after Sherman's order, 40,000 freed people had settled on their new land. They were farming 435,000 acres along the coast. Black communities were forming, governing themselves, making their own decisions. For the first time since being brought to America's shores in chains, these families were tasting true economic independence. They were building homes, planting crops, starting businesses. They were creating wealth, real wealth, that they could pass down to their children. Some of these settlements, like the one on Skidway Island led by Reverend Ulysses L. Houston, were home to over 1,000 people. They were proving what many had denied, that given the chance, freed people could build prosperous, self-sufficient communities. But then, April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and a Confederate sympathizer. African Americans in particular grieved the great president's death keenly. But it wasn't just his death that would threaten this unprecedented experiment in Black economic independence. It was who replaced him. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor and a Southern Democrat with a very specific vision for how the South should be rebuilt. While Congress and many in the North had supported land reform for freed people, Johnson had different priorities: appeasing former Confederates and maintaining white supremacy. Johnson wasn't just another president continuing Lincoln's policies. He was a committed segregationist who, in the words of legal scholars, wanted to basically return African Americans to a position of subordination, and he was about to use his presidential power to do exactly that. On May 29, 1865, just 6 weeks after Lincoln's death, Johnson issued what he called an amnesty proclamation. It sounded innocent enough, a gesture of reconciliation to heal the nation. But here's what they didn't tell you in the headlines. This amnesty meant pardoning Confederate landowners. And with those pardons came the right to reclaim their abandoned lands, the very same lands where thousands of Black families had been building their new lives. What happened next was nothing short of systematic theft. Black families who had spent months building homes, planting crops, and creating communities were suddenly told to get out. Many were evicted at gunpoint, forced to leave, just as their first crops were ready for harvest. The same Union Army that had once protected these settlements was now being used to force people off their land. Families who had finally gotten a taste of true freedom were about to learn a harsh lesson about power, politics, and broken promises in America. But here's where the story gets even darker, because this wasn't just a one-time betrayal. This was the beginning of a calculated pattern, one that would systematically strip away economic opportunity from generations of Black Americans. Through Johnson's amnesty proclamation on May 29, 1865, former Confederate landowners were pardoned and their property rights restored. The same people who had waged war against the Union were getting their land back, land that freed people had already started farming and building lives upon. And those freed people, they still needed somewhere to live, still needed to feed their families. Their options? The same land they were just evicted from, only now as sharecroppers. Think about this. After generations of enslavement, many freed people found themselves working the exact same land for the exact same former enslavers who had owned them, just under a different name. The promise of independence had been replaced by a new form of economic bondage. The results of this betrayal echo through generations. According to the Washington Post research, by the late 1860s, thousands of Black people who had been settled on their own land were abruptly evicted. Colonel Samuel Thomas reported to Congress that in many instances, freed people's certificates were taken from them, declared worthless, and destroyed right in front of their eyes. The legacy of this broken promise continues today. From 1910, when Black Americans owned around 15 million acres of land, to 1997, when they owned just 2 million acres, we've seen a systematic decline in Black land ownership that traces directly back to these early betrayals. But the most shocking part of this story was still to come, because behind all these broken promises and systematic betrayals lies a mathematical reality so staggering, it's almost impossible to comprehend. In 1860, plantation owners had put a price tag on nearly 4 million human beings, approximately $3 billion. They had literally calculated the worth of human beings like livestock in their ledgers, reducing lives, families, and futures to cold numbers in account books. This represented a significant portion of the nation's wealth. In fact, enslaved people were considered the largest single asset in America at the time, surpassing all other assets in the country combined. But the scale of this theft didn't end with emancipation. In fact, we can track it through hard numbers right up to the present day. Black Americans, despite every obstacle, managed to acquire 15 million acres of land by 1910. Most of this wasn't even given. It was bought through private transactions, acre by acre, particularly in states like Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, and South Carolina. In Mississippi alone, black farmers took advantage of underdeveloped bottomland near rivers that white landowners had ignored before the war. By 1900, 1/4 of all black farmers in the South owned their own land. Near the coast, they averaged 27 acres per farm. That's about 20 football fields of land. Inland, they managed to acquire even more, an average of 48 acres per farm, equivalent to 36 football fields or the size of 40 city blocks. This was still far behind white land ownership. 63% of Southern white farmers owned their land, but it represented a remarkable achievement of black economic independence, especially considering that just 35 years earlier, these farmers had been considered property themselves. However, by 1997, only 2 million acres remained in black hands. This wasn't just land changing hands through normal market forces. It was systemic dispossession through multiple means. Some families lost their land through legal technicalities. When land was passed down through generations without formal titles, they became vulnerable to losing everything. Others were stripped of their land through outright fraud or violence. But perhaps most shocking was the role of the U.S. Department of Agriculture itself. In 1997, the USDA's own Civil Rights Action Team admitted what black farmers had known for years, that the department was known as the last plantation. It was one of the last federal agencies to integrate, the last to include minorities in leadership, and was accused of actively working to push minority farmers off their land through discriminatory lending practices. This discrimination was so systematic that black farmers filed a massive class action lawsuit accusing the USDA of discrimination spanning nearly 2 decades, from 1981 to 1999. When the case came before federal judge Paul L. Friedman, he saw something familiar in this pattern. In his historic ruling, he drew a direct line from the government's first broken promise to its modern-day betrayal: 40 acres and a mule. The government broke that promise to African-American farmers. Over 100 years later, the USDA broke its promise to Mr. James Beverly. The human cost is equally staggering. From over 925,000 black farmers in 1920, the number plummeted to just 18,000 by 1997. For comparison, while white farmers also decreased during this period, the decline was far less severe. Even when black Americans managed to keep their land, they faced other threats. At Harris Neck, in the Sea Islands, for example, about 100 black farmers who had legally owned over 2,500 acres of high-quality land since the Reconstruction era continued living there until 1942. They were forced off their land due to a government plan to build an Air Force base, land that was later turned into a wildlife refuge in 1962. The story of America's broken promises to black Americans didn't end with lost farmland. In fact, throughout the 20th century, the United States had multiple chances to right these historic wrongs, opportunities that would have transformed the economic landscape for millions. Take the 1940s, for instance. As America emerged victorious from World War II, the government launched one of the most ambitious economic programs in history, the GI Bill. This massive federal initiative was designed to help veterans build wealth through education benefits, home loans, and business grants. But there was a catch. While the GI Bill was colorblind on paper, its implementation was anything but that. Take Mississippi, for example. Of the 3,200 Veteran Affairs-approved home loans given to veterans in that state in 1947, only 2, yes, 2 went to black veterans. These were men who had fought fascism abroad only to come home and find they couldn't access the same benefits as their white counterparts who had served alongside them. Local municipalities, armed with racial housing covenants and redlining practices, effectively blocked black veterans from accessing the same wealth-building opportunities their white counterparts enjoyed. Even the cornerstone of American retirement security, Social Security, was designed with built-in racial exclusions. When the program was created, it deliberately left out 2 key professions: domestic workers and farm laborers. This wasn't a coincidence. These exclusions effectively denied benefits to 60% of black workers across America and an astounding 75% in southern states. The results of these systematic exclusions are wild. Today, the average white family has roughly 10 times the wealth of the average black family, $171,000 compared to just $17,000. Even more telling, white high school dropouts have more wealth than black college graduates. But here's what makes this continued betrayal even more egregious. America knows how to do reparations. We've done it before, multiple times. Native Americans have received land and billions in benefits for being forcibly removed from their territories. Japanese Americans received $1.5 billion in reparations for their internment. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States even helped ensure that Holocaust survivors received reparations from Germany to the tune of 3.45 billion Deutsche Marks in 1952. Yet black Americans remain the only group that has never received reparations for state-sanctioned racial discrimination, despite slavery being the foundation that built much of America's initial wealth. The impact of this continued denial goes far beyond just numbers in a ledger. Wealth isn't just about money in the bank. It's about security, opportunity, and the ability to weather life's inevitable storms. During recessions, natural disasters, and yes, even global pandemics, families with assets can draw upon their wealth to recover. Those without it often face devastating setbacks that can last generations. This isn't just about the past anymore. This is happening in the present and will happen in the future. The racial wealth gap didn't result from a lack of hard work or financial literacy. Black Americans cannot close this gap through individual behavior or personal responsibility alone. The gap exists because of deliberate policy choices, and it will take deliberate policy choices to close it. And until America finally confronts this legacy and takes concrete steps to address it, the greatest economic betrayal in American history will continue to shape our future. So, what would a modern version of 40 acres and a mule actually look like? For Reverend Garrison Frazier and the other ministers who met with Sherman, land represented the foundation of economic independence. Today, that foundation has shifted. In our modern economy, education has become the new gateway to economic mobility. But here's where history rhymes with the present. Just as freed slaves needed more than just freedom papers to build wealth, today's black college graduates need more than just a diploma. The average black college graduate carries $45,000 in student loan debt, $15,000 more than their white counterparts. This crushing burden often negates the very economic mobility that education is supposed to provide. Some institutions are beginning to recognize this. Georgetown University, after discovering that the sale of enslaved people helped build their endowment, now provides full benefits to the descendants of those slaves to obtain degrees. The Virginia state legislature has followed suit, requiring state universities to create similar programs. But education alone isn't enough. Remember what the original 40 acres represented, the means to build independent wealth. Today, that translates into business ownership. Here's the modern reality. Black-owned businesses are more likely to be located in black neighborhoods that desperately need economic development. But these same business owners face systematic barriers to obtaining capital, the modern equivalent of being denied those surplus army mules needed to work the land. And just as the original 40 acres was about having a place to call your own, today's equation must include housing equity, but it has to go beyond just home ownership. Housing revitalization grants could help Black Americans rebuild existing homes in neighborhoods that have been systematically neglected due to decades of denied government and corporate investment. This isn't just about buying homes, it's about restoring communities. What makes these modern solutions different from past attempts is their comprehensive nature. Just as Sherman's original order wasn't just about land, but included protection and self-governance, today's solution must address the full scope of economic independence. For instance, universities like Princeton Theological Seminary are providing full benefits across the entire higher education pipeline to descendants of those whose sale helped build their endowments. The truth is, there is no perfect modern equivalent to 40 acres and a mule. The world has changed too much, but the principle remains the same: providing the tools and resources necessary for true economic independence. If you want to learn more, check out our video on redlining. It helps break down the horrific history of America and its everlasting fight against our people. This was Black Stories Untold, and as always, thanks for watching.